Shedeur Sanders is going to be keeping a bank busy in a matter of months. I mean, he already is, right, with NIL and how much he's getting paid. But the draft combine was last week, and now we're getting closer and closer to the draft. And in between the college football season and the draft, there's always a ton of scuttlebutt. It's fun, right? We get mock drafts. We get to hear from players, coaches. We get anonymous reports, right? We get anonymous takes by coaches who have talked to players during interviews. And that's what we're getting right now with the Shedeur Sanders situation, which we're going to start with. We're also going to hear from King McClure, Baylor women's coach Nikki Collin, and Charlie Cream, ESPN women's bracketologist. I had a chance to talk to him to break down the women's tournament coming up and all kinds of cool stuff there. But I do want to start with Shedeur because this is a story that's percolating right now that really has my interest. There were reports that came out of, when these guys go to Indianapolis for the combine, they meet with these teams. And we've all known that these meetings can become awkward and strange for players. The story is the meeting, I think, with Dez Bryant. I think it was Jeff Ireland, an executive for the Dolphins at the time. Dez Bryant mentioned to Mike or Jeff Ireland, he said, my dad was a pimp and my mom worked for my dad. And Jeff Ireland shot back or asked, was your mom a prostitute? And that was something where that was what we got out of that meeting, right? And we started to get more and more of that stuff. Like these guys go into these meetings with coaches and executives, and it's weird. I mean, they try to break down your psychological profile. They try to learn as much about you as they possibly can because they're going to be spending tens of millions of dollars on some of these picks. So to a degree, it's understandable. There's also an argument to be said like, look, these guys are not cattle. They're not to be poked and prodded and treated like we're about to commit them to some kind of psych ward, and we need to figure out which section of the ward we're going to commit them to. These are young men, bright guys for the most part, who obviously have a unique athletic ability that they're going to use to make them a lot of money. And the report came out. First, I heard it from my boy McShay on The Ringer on the Todd McShay show. And then there was more from Josina Anderson and a couple coaches. McShay said he talked to two organizations that went out of their way during a conversation with Todd to mention to them that Shedeur Sanders was kind of coming off arrogant, unprofessional during these meetings with particular teams. And Josina Anderson mentioned that a quarterback's coach from a team that picks in the top 7 told her that he came off as brash or arrogant. Now, if you've watched Shedeur Sanders, there's a lot of glitz, glam, and hype, and Colorado and Coach Prime around this team. So there's a lot of sizzle and a lot of hype around Colorado this year. At the end of the day, it's a dude that threw 37 touchdown passes and passed for more than 4,000 yards and was the Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year and engineered an amazing offense for Colorado this year. Shows amazing poise, is by all accounts a great teammate. You look at that Hail Mary he threw against Baylor for a win. I think it was in week 3 or 4. That was after like the 1,500th time the guy had to peel himself up off the ground after just being hammered all evening long by an aggressive Baylor defense and behind like a shoddy offensive line. But he never showed any kind of defeat, right, in the eyes of a lot of adversity. And then even, by all accounts, and if you want to go back and watch the reports, and if you watch most of his media over the course of the fall, was really like a good dude to media. Like he would address somebody like, me, right? I call games for ESPN, but if I show up at Colorado's football game and I'm in the crowd asking a question, he's not going to know who I am. But he still apparently treats people he doesn't know just as well as people, bigger names, right, that are at games. Someone like a Kirk Herbstreit, who, of course, like you know who that is. He'll treat the last bozo on the bus, like me, the same exact way. So, like, he's a good dude, and he hasn't shown too many signs of being like a malcontent. But regardless, Shedeur Sanders is at the top of some mock drafts and was at the top of a lot more before this news came out. He could go as high as 3 to the Giants, but after these reports over the past week, a lot of mock drafts have him going as late as 28 to the Jets. And there's a lot of reasons around if these reports are true. I would probably believe that it was either misinterpretation of, how Shedeur was behaving by some of these officials with teams. I'll also say too, like, the times are changing, dude. Like, the days of, like, these guys, like, they have a lot of power and control. I have said before that Colorado, and I predicted that Shedeur could drop out of the first round a couple weeks ago for the simple fact, or a couple months ago, for the simple fact that Colorado is not, and Coach Prime are not as in control of things as they're accustomed to being. The NFL teams decide where you're going to be drafted, right? And so if there's a vibe or a feeling they get about you, they have the right to draft you as late as they want or to pass on you. But there's also a probability or a possibility that this was maybe almost on purpose. Like, maybe this was an organization who Shedeur doesn't want to play for. It's very possible, if you look at history, that they're trying to massage and find a place for him to get drafted. When you look at Jack Elway and John Elway, all the way back to 1983, John Elway, a white quarterback, right, who was Mr. Uppity, buttoned up, great kid, right? Shedeur, sass and sizzle and all that, right? It's interesting how we look at these two differently. But John Elway was not going to play for the Baltimore Colts. And his father said, we're not going to play for the Colts if they draft us, ultimately forcing the Colts' hand and ending up, I think the Colts had moved to Indy by then. Maybe they hadn't, but it was like around that year, maybe the year before. But he forced the Colts' hand and ended up with the Broncos drafting him, which was an amazing career move, right? At the time, I do remember Terry Bradshaw, just watching some footage. He did kind of come after John Elway. So I don't want to play the race card here and get Shedeur's back and say, hey, this is like we're looking at this through a lens of race. But it is interesting, right, that I think we do cling on to this stuff a little bit more. I just think that's kind of a problem with society. But cling on to the race stuff a little bit more, right? Like if I don't know, if Dylan Gabriel was as good as Shedeur, I think people might be like, oh, well, Dylan wants to play somewhere else. With Shedeur, they're like, yo, man, he's like, he's being ignorant. It's like, yeah, hold on. I do believe there is some of that. I truly do, like it or not. It's uncomfortable, but it's true. Also, more recently, Eli Manning and Archie Manning, right? Eli was not going to play for the San Diego Chargers. They were an organization that was in free fall. And Eli Manning and his dad, Archie, did everything in their power to see to it that the Chargers would not draft him. He goes to the Giants, a much better organization at the time, and they win 2 Super Bowls. So the blueprint is there for if you don't feel comfortable going to a certain team. It's not the most egregious or awful thing in the world to try to massage an opportunity to go play somewhere else. And it's certainly not something that's being invented right before our eyes. So the last thing I will say, which is interesting, which McShay tried to point this out, and I got to talk to Todd about this, at least text him about it or ask him about it, because he does bring up a decent point. His former employer, my current employer, ESPN, they have the draft, right? And so Todd mentioned that it's interesting that you have not heard ESPN reporting some of this stuff, because when you think about the coverage of the draft, it's going to be heavy Shedeur Sanders. It's going to be heavy Travis Hunter. And we all know, just seeing Dion, like if you cross a line with Colorado, which he deems to be unfair or inflammatory, you get shut out. And I think that's like, look, man, again, that's the world we live in. I don't like this term, but I don't have a better one right now. It's like, it's not fun when the rabbit has the gun, and it's different now. Like A lot of these players, this is the player empowerment era. They don't need the media like they once did. Now, again, this is an old system, and these executives get to draft who they want to draft when they want to draft them. So if you're really worried about slotting in the NFL draft and how high you can get taken, you do kind of want to kowtow and be buttoned up in these interviews. But I have a hard time believing that Shedeur Sanders walked into these meetings and was like a total prick or was a total flake. I just don't believe it. He's given me no evidence to the contrary, right? Other than him being a really good guy. I've seen nothing to the contrary of that. And he's been totally affable with the meeting, with the media, everything I've seen. So I think it's there's a little bit of bias still towards Colorado. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. I think regardless of what happens, Shedeur Sanders can play his ass off, and he's going to be an amazing NFL player. And I think he might be better suited going to an organization where there's a better support system around him. And don't think that his father, who is very well informed and in tune with how this situation goes, doesn't have a big say in what's going on right now. And it's not something where they're shooting from the hip. This is a very well thought out situation, in my estimation, for Deion and Shedeur. So it'll be interesting to follow that, but a lot of interesting stuff going on there. We move on now to talk about college hoops. I had West Virginia and UCF on Saturday. And boy, 14,000 people in Morgantown in the West Virginia Coliseum. What an amazing atmosphere. You forget that that's like the only show in town in the state. I remember hearing Bob Huggins. He actually told us this, me and my broadcast partner, a few years ago, the first time I went to Morgantown, that, he lets these kids know, even when they're having a down year, that the whole state is behind this team. That's really something